Most thrillers push tension forward with noise, speed, and spectacle. The Vanishing does something far more unsettling. It slows everything down. No frantic editing, no dramatic warnings, just calm, methodical steps toward an answer that feels inevitable long before it arrives. This film doesn't ask you to be afraid, it asks you to be patient, and that patience becomes dangerous, because every quiet moment, every ordinary decision is part of a design that never bends to emotion or mercy. Beneath its restrained surface lie 20 disturbing truths about obsession, control, and a filmmaker who believed comfort was a lie. Once you see how this story was engineered, you'll realize the fear was never accidental, and the ending was never meant to save you. To understand why this film still unsettles audiences decades later, we need to look past the story itself and into the decisions that shaped it. These are 20 unsettling facts about The Vanishing, and the first one reveals how this quiet nightmare was designed from the very beginning. 1. Before The Vanishing ever became known for its haunting effect on audiences, it began as an idea rooted in inevitability rather than suspense. The story was never conceived as a puzzle to be solved, but as a process to be endured. From its earliest development, the focus wasn't on what would happen, but on how calmly it could happen without interruption. Director George Slicer approached the material with a mindset that ran against nearly every thriller convention of the time. He believed that fear collapses when chaos takes over. The louder a film becomes, the safer the audience feels because noise implies loss of control. His solution was to remove excess emotion entirely. No urgency, no dramatization, just steady progression. This philosophy shaped the film's DNA. Scenes unfold as if nothing is being forced. Dialogue is measured almost polite. Even moments that should feel dangerous arrive without warning or emphasis. The effect is unsettling because the film never signals when to brace yourself. From the very beginning, The Vanishing wasn't designed to scare through shock. It was designed to test how long an audience could remain calm while moving toward something they already knew they couldn't escape. 2. One of the most radical decisions behind The Vanishing was its refusal to frame obsession as irrational. In most psychological thrillers, fixation is portrayed as something extreme, unstable, or visibly destructive. Here it is presented as logical, patient, and disturbingly reasonable. Every step taken by the characters follows a clear internal logic. There are no emotional breakdowns to warn the audience that things have gone too far. No dramatic turning point where obsession becomes obvious. Instead, it grows quietly disguised as persistence, responsibility, and the need for closure. This approach removes moral distance. Viewers can't easily say, "I would never do that," because each decision feels justified in isolation. The film understands something uncomfortable about human behavior. Obsession rarely feels dangerous from the inside. It feels necessary. By grounding fixation in rational thought rather than emotional excess, The Vanishing reframes curiosity itself as a vulnerability. The audience isn't asked to judge the characters, they're asked to recognize them. And that recognition is where the unease begins to take hold. 3. Another deeply unsettling choice lies in how The Vanishing treats time. Unlike most thrillers, the film does not race toward its destination. It moves steadily, almost indifferently, as if the outcome were already decided and time itself were simply fulfilling a function. This pacing was intentional and risky. Slicer understood that urgency creates hope. The faster a story moves, the more viewers believe intervention is possible. By slowing everything down, the film removes that illusion. Time does not become an enemy to beat. It becomes a neutral force that allows events to unfold exactly as planned. Scenes are allowed to breathe longer than expected. Conversations repeat in subtle ways. The film does not reward patience with relief. Instead, patience becomes part of the trap. The longer the audience stays, the clearer it becomes that waiting will not change anything. In The Vanishing, time is not used to build suspense. It is used to dismantle it, replacing anticipation with certainty. And once that certainty settles in, the film no longer needs to frighten you. It simply continues. 4. A defining feature of The Vanishing is how carefully it withholds emotional guidance. Most films rely on music, camera movement, or performance cues to tell viewers how to feel. Here, those signals are deliberately minimized. The film rarely underlines moments of danger or grief. It simply presents them, then steps back. This restraint places the burden of interpretation entirely on the audience. Without emotional signposts, viewers are forced to sit with uncertainty, deciding for themselves what each moment means and how much it should hurt. That silence isn't neutral. It's strategic. By refusing to comfort, the film creates a space where unease can grow unchecked. Sluizer understood that fear intensifies when it isn't named. The absence of emotional framing prevents release. There is no swell of music to signal resolution, no visual emphasis to suggest importance. Everything is treated with the same calm attention, making even ordinary moments feel unstable. In this way, the film turns detachment into a weapon. It doesn't overwhelm you, it leaves you alone with your reactions, and that isolation is where the dread takes root. 5. The film's pacing was one of its most controversial choices, especially upon release. Scenes move at a measured, almost stubborn tempo. Conversations linger. Actions repeat. Time seems to stretch without offering progress. For some viewers, this felt frustrating. For the film, it was essential. This rhythm mirrors the psychology at the heart of the story. Obsession doesn't surge forward, it circles. By allowing scenes to unfold without urgency, the film recreates that looping mental state. Each return to familiar spaces and emotions erodes the audience's expectation of change. What's unsettling is how quietly this conditioning occurs. There is no obvious slowdown, no moment where the film announces its intent. Instead, it simply refuses to accelerate. Over time, viewers adjust, accepting the pace as inevitable. By the time the consequences arrive, impatience has been replaced with resignation. The film doesn't trap its audience through force. It traps them through repetition until waiting itself becomes part of the experience. 6. Perhaps the most subversive idea in The Vanishing is how it reframes curiosity. In traditional narratives, the search for answers is heroic. Persistence is rewarded. Here, curiosity is portrayed as something exploitable, a weakness rather than a virtue. The film treats the desire to know as entirely understandable. It never mocks it. It never condemns it. Each step toward the truth feels reasonable, even responsible. That empathy is crucial because it prevents the audience from distancing themselves from what unfolds. Instead of warning against obsession, the film normalizes it. Logic replaces instinct. Certainty overrides caution. Nothing feels reckless until it's too late to reconsider. The danger lies not in impulse but in patience. By presenting curiosity as a slow-moving threat, the film delivers its most unsettling suggestion that the need for answers can quietly dismantle self-preservation. And once that realization settles in, the story's calm surface begins to feel far more dangerous than any sudden shock. 7. One of the most unsettling strategies in The Vanishing is its commitment to narrative neutrality. The film refuses to tell the audience how to judge what they're seeing. There is no moral framing, no cinematic shorthand to signal outrage or sympathy. Events are presented plainly, as if judgment were irrelevant to their outcome. This neutrality strips away a layer of protection viewers often rely on. Without clear moral cues, it becomes difficult to position yourself safely outside the story. You are not guided toward condemnation or comfort. You are simply shown what happens when choices are followed to their logical end. By declining to editorialize, the film suggests something deeply uncomfortable, that meaning is not always assigned by justice or intention. Sometimes things occur without offering a lesson that feels reassuring. The camera's calm observation reinforces this idea, treating every action with the same measured attention. In doing so, The Vanishing transforms itself from a story into a record. And records don't negotiate, they document. That cold clarity is what makes the experience so difficult to shake. 8. Perspective in The Vanishing is carefully controlled but never fully settled. Just when the audience begins to emotionally align with one viewpoint, the film subtly pulls back, creating distance instead of intimacy. This constant adjustment prevents full emotional anchoring. The effect is disorienting in a quiet way. You understand the motivations at play, but you are never allowed to feel secure in them. The film resists identification, keeping viewers slightly removed from every character's inner world. That distance prevents catharsis from forming. Rather than building toward a single emotional climax, the film disperses tension evenly across its runtime. There is no release valve, no moment where empathy or outrage can safely peak and resolve. Everything remains suspended. This shifting perspective reinforces the film's central idea: understanding does not equal control. You may see the shape of events clearly, but clarity offers no protection. The story continues regardless of where your sympathy lies. 9. The ordinariness of The Vanishing's world is one of its most disturbing qualities. Locations are familiar, interactions feel routine. Nothing in the film's visual language suggests heightened danger. There are no exaggerated shadows or stylized warnings. This realism removes the audience's ability to dismiss the story as exceptional. By grounding everything in everyday environments, the film implies that terror doesn't require a separate, darker world. It only requires a fracture in a normal one. The absence of visual spectacle makes the horror portable. Viewers don't leave it behind when the film ends. It follows them into ordinary spaces where nothing appears threatening until it is. By refusing to stylize fear, The Vanishing makes its most unsettling promise: what you've witnessed is not confined to fiction, and that realization lingers far longer than any shock ever could. 10. One of the most calculated decisions in The Vanishing is how it manages information not to deepen mystery but to eliminate hope. Unlike most thrillers that ration details to prolong suspense, this film often reveals crucial facts earlier than expected. The intention isn't surprise, it's inevitability. By allowing the audience to understand the situation clearly, the film removes the fantasy of intervention. Once the rules are visible, nothing breaks them. Each new piece of information doesn't open possibilities, it closes them. The story becomes a narrowing corridor rather than a branching path. This approach requires restraint. There are no fake-outs, no sudden reversals designed to restore optimism. The narrative behaves like a system already set in motion. Understanding doesn't empower the viewer, it confines them. In The Vanishing, knowledge is not a reward, it's a mechanism. The more you know, the less room there is to believe in escape, and that quiet collapse of possibility is far more unsettling than ignorance ever could be. 11. Another radical choice is the film's refusal to escalate. Traditional thrillers rely on rising stakes, faster cuts, louder music, heightened danger. The Vanishing rejects all of it. From beginning to end, it maintains a controlled emotional temperature. This creates an unusual tension. Because the film never explodes, it never resets. Viewers remain suspended in a continuous state of unease, unable to release it through shock or action. The pressure doesn't spike, it presses. Slauser understood that escalation offers comfort. Once tension peaks, it promises relief. By denying that structure, the film traps the audience in continuity. There is no single moment that defines the experience. Everything feels evenly weighted, equally final. The result is a kind of emotional suffocation. Fear doesn't arrive as a climax. It settles in as a constant. And once settled, it becomes impossible to shake. 12. Perhaps the most disorienting aspect of The Vanishing is how it treats moments that would normally be framed as dramatic. Scenes with life-altering consequences are presented without emphasis. No music swell, no visual underline, no pause to acknowledge significance. This flattening forces the audience to confront events without emotional cushioning. You are not guided toward grief or outrage. You are simply shown what happens and left alone to process it. That solitude is where the discomfort deepens. By refusing to distinguish between ordinary actions and irreversible ones, the film suggests that meaning is not determined by intensity. Some of the most devastating moments arrive quietly without ceremony. In denying drama, The Vanishing delivers its coldest idea yet, that the world does not adjust itself to mark turning points. Things happen, life continues, and understanding that truth may be the hardest part to endure. 13. The ending of The Vanishing is often described as shocking, but shock was never its objective. What makes it endure is how methodically it refuses emotional negotiation. By the time the film reaches its final moments, the audience has already been conditioned to understand that nothing will intervene. The conclusion doesn't arrive as a twist, it arrives as confirmation. There is no attempt to soften what happens with symbolism or ambiguity. The film presents its outcome as the natural result of a process that has been unfolding calmly from the beginning. This clarity is what unsettles viewers most. There is nowhere to hide interpretation, no alternative reading that restores comfort. Many audiences reacted with anger not because the ending was cruel, but because it felt immovable. The film does not acknowledge the viewer's desire for relief. It simply completes its logic and stops. That finality feels less like drama and more like a door closing. In refusing emotional compensation, the film challenges a core expectation of storytelling that answers are meant to heal. Here, the answer exists only to demonstrate how little healing it provides. 14. The controversy surrounding the film grew precisely because it would not compromise that ending. Early reactions ranged from stunned silence to outright hostility. Some viewers accused the film of being unfair, even manipulative. But what disturbed them most was not what happened, it was the absence of commentary afterward. The film does not condemn its events. It does not offer a moral lens through which to safely process them. Instead, it presents cause and effect with clinical neutrality. Choices are made. Consequences follow. No lesson is spelled out. This refusal to guide interpretation placed an unusual burden on the audience. Without a clear moral position, viewers were forced to supply their own judgment, and many found that responsibility deeply uncomfortable. The film's silence felt accusatory, as if it were asking the audience to confront their own expectations rather than the story itself. That tension between viewer and film is what kept the debate alive. The Vanishing didn't just divide opinions, it exposed how much reassurance audiences expect from narratives they invest in emotionally. 15. Over time, what was once labeled cruelty began to be re-examined as discipline. Critics and filmmakers looking back on The Vanishing recognized that its power came not from excess, but from refusal, the refusal to dilute its ideas for approval. The film did not seek to punish its audience, it sought to remain honest. In an industry built on resolution, that honesty felt radical. The story was allowed to end where it logically should not, where it felt emotionally acceptable. This integrity is why the film has outlasted many of its contemporaries. It isn't remembered for spectacle or surprise, but for the discomfort it leaves unresolved. Viewers may disagree with its choices, but they rarely forget them. In the end, The Vanishing earned its legacy not by offering meaning, but by withholding it, forcing audiences to confront the unsettling possibility that some truths exist without purpose, and some endings are final simply because they are. 16. As time passed, The Vanishing began to separate itself from the era that produced it. While many thrillers of the late 1980s became defined by stylistic excess or dated techniques, this film aged in the opposite direction. Its restraint kept it from being anchored to a trend. What once felt cold began to feel timeless. Revisiting the film years later often produces a different reaction. Viewers notice how little it relies on cultural context or technological novelty. Its unease comes from behavior, not aesthetics, that makes it resistant to nostalgia. Instead of softening with age, it hardens. This durability has allowed The Vanishing to remain unsettling across generations. New audiences don't approach it as a relic. They encounter it as a challenge, one that refuses to adapt to modern expectations of explanation or empathy. In a landscape increasingly dominated by clarity and resolution, the film's refusal to evolve becomes its strength. It stands still, daring viewers to meet it where it is. 17. The influence of The Vanishing is rarely obvious, but it runs deep. Rather than inspiring imitation, it shaped how psychological tension could be constructed without spectacle. Later filmmakers borrowed its patience, its trust in silence, and its belief that fear doesn't need escalation to be effective. Where many successors softened their conclusions to preserve audience goodwill, this film set a boundary. It demonstrated how far a story could go without breaking its internal logic. In that sense, it became less a template and more a measuring stick. Filmmakers often reference it not for its scenes, but for its discipline. It showed that withholding comfort requires confidence and that audiences can be trusted to endure discomfort even if they resist it at first. Its legacy lives not in homage but in restraint. Whenever a film chooses silence over noise, certainty over chaos, The Vanishing can be felt in the background. 18. Perhaps the clearest sign of the film's lasting power is how discussions around it rarely end. Viewers don't debate favorite moments or technical achievements. They return to a single question that refuses to settle. Was knowing worth it? That question transforms the film from a finished work into a personal reckoning. It invites viewers to measure their own limits, how much certainty they believe they need, and what they would risk to obtain it. The story doesn't answer that question, it relocates it. This is why The Vanishing continues to disturb long after viewing. Memory doesn't dull it, it sharpens it. The more distance you gain, the more clearly its intent emerges. In the end, the film doesn't disappear when it's over. It waits quietly until you realize the question it planted was never meant to be resolved. What makes The Vanishing increasingly unsettling for modern audiences is how little it tries to accommodate contemporary storytelling habits. Today's thrillers often explain, diagnose, and contextualize behavior, offering psychological labels that help viewers feel oriented. This film refuses all of that. It does not translate its horror into language that can be managed. As a result, rewatching it now can feel more disturbing than it did decades ago. The film offers no framework to help the audience process what they've seen. There is no reassurance that understanding leads to control or that insight provides safety. Behavior is shown plainly without commentary. This refusal has made the film feel almost confrontational in hindsight. It doesn't adapt itself to changing tastes. It doesn't soften with time. Instead, it exposes how dependent modern audiences have become on explanation as a form of comfort. By denying that comfort, The Vanishing remains resistant to interpretation fatigue. It doesn't invite repeated viewing for clarity. It endures because it never pretends clarity will help. 20. The final reason The Vanishing continues to linger lies in its moral silence. The film does not instruct the audience on what to think, feel, or condemn. It leaves a vacuum where commentary would normally exist, and that absence becomes its final act. Without guidance, viewers instinctively turn inward. They begin asking what they would have done differently and whether that difference would have mattered. The film offers no reassurance that better choices lead to better outcomes. It refuses to validate moral optimism. By ending without judgment, the story hands responsibility back to the audience, not to solve the narrative, but to live with it. The discomfort doesn't come from what happens on screen. It comes from what the film refuses to say afterward. And in that refusal, The Vanishing completes its design, not as a puzzle to be solved, not as a warning to be decoded, but as an experience that quietly insists on being remembered because it never pretends that memory itself is safe. One detail that often goes unnoticed about The Vanishing is how firmly its creator refused to reinterpret the film after the fact. As years passed and audiences grew more vocal about the ending, many expected some form of clarification, an explanation that might soften its implications or reframe its intent. That never came. Instead, the film was left exactly as it was conceived, closed, unyielding, and uninterested in negotiation. There was no alternate meaning offered to ease discomfort, no suggestion that the story had been misunderstood. The silence was deliberate. Any attempt to explain the film further would have undermined its central idea that certainty is not a reward, and answers do not guarantee peace. What makes this especially unsettling is how rare that stance is. Most controversial films evolve with their audiences. This one refused to. It remained fixed, confident that the discomfort it created was not a flaw but the point itself. In that sense, the film doesn't just end, it seals itself. Not as a provocation, but as a boundary. A reminder that some stories are not meant to comfort, reinterpret, or heal. They are meant to confront a limit, and stop there. Years later, The Vanishing still resists classification. It isn't remembered for spectacle twists or shock, but for the quiet weight it leaves behind. The film doesn't fade once it's over. It settles asking nothing, explaining nothing. Some viewers see it as cruel, others see it as honest, but almost everyone agrees on one thing: it doesn't let go easily. So here's the question that continues to divide audiences long after the credits roll. If you were offered the truth knowing it would give you no escape, no closure, and no relief, would you still choose to hear it? That answer may say more about you than the film ever does.